Well, this is our second Sunday in a 9-week series where we are on the theme Stained Glass Stories. The plan is to begin on the west wall and move window to window, back to front, then up to our spectacular children's window, and then to begin on the east wall, moving window to window, back to front. Whatever else, this means that we began with the nativity window last Sunday and that we will eventually end at the resurrection window. The rest of the windows are not quite in chronological order. As I shared with the children, today's focus is our children's window. Next week, Pastor Liz will focus on what we call the good neighbor window. And since we're focusing on the teaching window, on the back page of your bulletin is a worksheet where you can take notes as if you were in a class. In our window, Jesus is seated maybe on a rock, and he's teaching a group of 3 men and 2 women. As with our other windows, depictions of the adult Jesus show him in a robe, a white robe emblazoned with a golden cross. And then clasped over his shoulders is a cape that's red, and that is to symbolize his passion, that he is going to give his life for the sake of the world. Around his head, there is also what's called a nimbus, N-I-M-B-U-S. We typically might refer to that as a halo or an aura, but it's a nimbus, and that is to signify Jesus' divinity. And one of the things that you note as if you look at the 2 windows that are beside each other is that Jesus' nimbus is much brighter in the nativity window than it is in the teaching window. As shared on our Facebook page this week, stained glass windows have long held a unique power, serving as vibrant storytellers of biblical tales. These sacred windows transcend decoration to offer a visual narrative. During times when literacy was low, stained glass windows became an essential way to convey biblical stories. And still today, the intricate designs and vivid colors capture scenes that make biblical stories accessible to all, regardless of their ability to read. So speaking of reading ability, when we were young, my brother and I were gifted a 7 sort of volume stories of the Bible, and they were illustrated in a comic books format. Some of you are nodding, some of you had those. They were mainly in black and white, but some of the illustrations were in color, and they were published by David C. Cook. And so I was delighted earlier this week to find the Action Bible upstairs in one of our classrooms. All of the illustrations are in full color, published by David C. Cook. Now, this reminded me of how I would pore over those 7 books when I was in 2nd and 3rd grade. I wanted to know the biblical stories. But like stained glass windows, these visual illustrations cannot depict the whole of any particular biblical story. And so, for example, the story of Moses, God giving the 10 Commandments to the Israelite people is depicted on just 1 page. And then the story of Jesus teaching the Beatitudes to his disciples just takes up 2 speech bubbles on less than a page. And this, for me, calls to mind the recent Louisiana law requiring a poster-size display of the Ten Commandments in, quote, large, easily readable font to hang in every public classroom from kindergartens to universities. And when signing this law, the Louisiana governor said, quote, if you want to respect the rule of law, you've got to start from the original lawgiver, which is Moses. Had this been an exam, the governor's statement would have been marked incorrect. Because according to the Bible, God is the original lawgiver who gave them to Moses. And you can see in the Bible, in both Exodus and Deuteronomy, that it says that God inscribed them on the tablets. In Exodus, it says by his own finger. Be that as it may. A week later, Oklahoma's top election official, I was thinking he was probably singing whatever you can do, I can do better. And though he doesn't seem to have this authority, he required all public schools to begin including lessons from the Bible for students 5th through 12th grades, stating, quote, immediate and strict compliance is expected. Indeed, since 2002, 13 states have made efforts to ensure that the Ten Commandments are displayed in public schools. Now, to me, such efforts smack of virtue signaling, of making a display of piety before men, which, of course, Jesus sharply rebuked. As writer Kurt Vonnegut once said, for some reason, the most vocal Christians among us never mention the Beatitudes. But often, with tears in their eyes, they demand the Ten Commandments be posted in public buildings. I've not heard one of them demand that the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes be posted anywhere. So pondering this, and because we are focused on the teaching window, I have developed 3 classroom exercises to aid teachers who are subject to these state laws and regulations. And because I did this too, because Jesus often engaged in hyperbole. I don't mean to be mean-spirited, but it is exaggerated. The first exercise will be on the topic, which Ten Commandment did Jesus cite as being the most important commandment when he was asked? The curriculum would then help the students identify the fact that there are 613 commandments in the Hebrew Scriptures, 365 positive commands, you shall do, and 248 negative commands, you shall not do. Now, I'm certain that the students would be fascinated to learn that the 365 positive commands correspond to the number of days in a solar year, and that the number 248 negative commands coincides with the number of bones and major organs that Jewish teachers then believed made up the human body. Now, the curriculum would actually introduce both versions of the Ten Commandments from Exodus and Deuteronomy, so the students might better have a chance of answering that question, which of the Ten Commandments did Jesus say was most important when he was asked? a teacher would have to give the hint that Jesus did not name any of the 10 commandments when he was asked which was the most important commandment. Rather, Jesus quoted 2 positive commands from among the 603 other commandments in the Jewish scriptures. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The students would learn that Jesus actually combined 2 commandments, one from Leviticus. Anybody read Leviticus lately? And one from Deuteronomy, Leviticus 19:18 and Deuteronomy 6:5-6. And the critical thinking part of this exercise would be the essay, where students reflect on why Jesus chose not to quote any of the 10 commandments when he was asked which was most important, but chose from among these others. There's a lot of directions to go there, but I want to move on to the second exercise. And that exercise would be to compare and contrast the Sermon on the Mount with the 10 Commandments, with special attention to the Beatitudes. Students would learn that Jesus does expand on a couple of the 10 Commandments when preaching the Sermon on the Mount. In particular, the commandment not to commit adultery. And in that spot, Jesus adds a few words about the relationship between adultery and divorce. And during this exercise, students would research which elected officials or candidates had violated this commandment, while also supporting legislation to publicly display them. Now, I'm not judging here, but I'm also not a politician or a pundit, nor am I even a preacher who wants to engage in virtue signaling. An optional exercise, especially for the older students, would include having the students write actual legislation that proposes that the Beatitudes be posted in large, easily readable fonts in every public classroom. Think of the educational value for students to see which elected officials might object to have actual teachings of Jesus posted in public classrooms. A third classroom exercise would point out that just as there are 2 versions of the 10 Commandments, there are, as I said, 2 versions of the Beatitudes, one in Matthew and one in Luke. And students would learn that while there are 9 Beatitudes in the Gospel of Matthew, there are only 4 in the Gospel of Luke. But that each of those 4 Beatitudes is paired with 4 woes. So students would read Luke's version, pondering why some folks desperately want the commandments posted in public spaces, but do not invest the same energy when it comes to posting the actual teachings of Jesus. In fact, let's do part of that exercise together, shall we? In your pew Bibles, turn to page 838. We're going to look at Luke 6. And we're going to read verse 20, take a break, and then we're going to read verse 24. We're going to do this in unison. So, I invite you to join me. Verse 20. Then he looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Now notice he doesn't say poor in spirit, he means poor. Do any of us consider ourselves poor? Let's just read the woe. Verse 24, aloud together. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Now, to help the students understand true poverty and true wealth, they would, and this is a take-home exercise, they would ask their parents about their family income. And so they would put their family income into the search, how rich am I, at the website givingwhatyoucan.org. And they would discover, for example, that a family of 4 with a post-tax, a take-home income of $50,000 would be in the richest 17% of global wealth. That means wealthier than 83% of the global population. If the income is $100,000 for a family of 4, that would make them richer than 93% of the global population. Oh, by the way, those numbers are already adjusted for the difference of cost of living between countries. Santa Barbara's expensive. But if you make $50,000 anywhere in the U.S., you're wealthier than 83% of the global population. And so, as a next step, the students would research the financial disclosures of elected public officials. So, I doubt there's going to be any legislation to post Luke's version of the Beatitudes and woes. Not in public schools, probably not even in most Christian schools. But what if our churches hung a massive banner from our bell tower with the blessing and woes? I mean, this is private property. It would be a public proclamation. And what if churches all over the country did that to focus on what Jesus actually taught? Indeed, what would happen if churches like ours made sure to send posters of those Beatitudes and woes to every teacher in those states for each of their classrooms? Indeed, what if we all printed little business side cards to give to the students so they could keep them in their pockets? What Christian politician in any of those states could object to that? But they might. Amen.